Can you hear me? Yeah? Yes, that's the order we're going. Can you hear me?
It's a great pleasure to be here at this university and be here at this conference. Of course, partition is always contested, however way you look at data and information we can gather for partition studies. Perspective of the writer, the kind of information you get, and how this information is gathered and out in today's discussion. We have 3 speakers, and 5 to 7 minutes of Q&A, and then we shall move on to the next speaker. And if you have a few minutes at the end, if you have any pressing questions you'd like to raise, we'll take that. All right? Now, I do have a watch. That helps. So first we have Alia Carter, who is interested in Colonial Archives, and she's going to present us talk about the history, discovery, and access to South Asian colonial records in the UK. So we start with Alia.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the conveners and to BRAC University and all who helped set up these fabulous conferences. And thank you for the opportunity to present my research. So, just to introduce myself, I did an MA in Archives and Records Management at UCL in 21-22, and my dissertation was on the history and discovery and access of colonial Indian records in the British Library's India Office and the National Archives. So my talk will be on 3 parts. So it's a brief overview of my dissertation, the use of India Office archives in creative writing, and this is a new research I'm doing. It's on E.M. Forster's A Passage to India and the way he used archives in his creative work, and then issues with accessing the archives, especially for South Asian users. So this talk will be predominantly on the British Raj, and as it was then, about the access to archives of this period there are in the UK, paywalls, and how memorialising from the British perspective has shaped the UK and South Asian diaspora to some extent. And just a little note on me, I'm South Asian, born in the UK with a split family, so my mother's side is in North India. My father's side was also in North India because they're cousins, but they moved to Pakistan during the partition, which still causes a few issues to this day. So next slide please. So this is the inspiration for my master's. So there's a quote there by Charles Seffert, who says, "A race without the knowledge of its history is like a tree without roots. It is the inspiring influence of that knowledge which makes men want to go forward. To advance forward, then, you must press backward. The whole future of man is bound up in the doings of the past. Know it well, and no one will be able to deceive or make you afraid." And then Harry S. Truman also said, "The only thing new in the world is the history you do not know." Next slide, please. My dissertation was a post-colonial look at why Indian colonial records were in the UK in the first place and what exists online as guides to these collections. And later in the talk, I'll talk about digitisation, Adam Matthews, for example, a survey on the experiences of global users of the material and what I feel are the barriers to access and the key improvements that can be made. Next slide, please. So controlling the narrative, the India Office Archive at the British Library, what kinds of records were they, who collected these records, and where did the records go after partition? Next slide, please. So what kinds of records are housed in the UK? So they're records relating to the vast period of British rule and subsequent handover of nation building at partition. They're mainly in the British Library India Office, the India Office Library, and a lesser extent at the National Archives UK. So a lot of the audience will be familiar with these, but they detail the activities and responsibilities of the India Office, Burma Office, East India Company, and the Board of Control, and smaller groups of records transferred from related institutions in Britain. And at its height, the Government of India controlled not just the local government, statutory bodies, port trust, all matters relating to foreign relations, defences of the country, general taxation, currency. There's quite a long list of what these records would entail. That's there. Next slide, please. So it's interesting to note who collected these records. So at the start of the empire, it also started the Herald did the start of the Indian and the Home, the UK civil service. So the domestic bureaucracy was itself shaped by the administrative demands of a growing global empire. And the civil service was exclusively British. The effect was to exclude Indians from offices of trust and power in British India, and the exams were held for the civil servants in the UK. And then Anne Laura Stoller talks about how colonial publishing houses made sure that documents were selectively disseminated, duplicated, or destroyed. And the little plaque on the right-hand side is a commemoration to the civil services of the Crown in India, which is in Westminster Abbey to this day. Next slide, please. So where did these records go after partition? So in 1947, the India office was abolished, staff transferred to the CRO, the Indian Records section, later the India Office Records, and the India Office Library continued to exist as distinct entities. And in 1947, a Lord Mountbatten paper entitled The Administrative Consequences of Partition detailed officers taking into account every record and every file to determine to which side they should go. So the paperwork in India was split, which is another difficulty with the histories of all countries. And a lot of these problematic records were destroyed. So there's a note in the TNA documents about fires that were burning all these documents. So the infamous bonfire of documents as the British left India was widely reported at the time in the press and referenced in a note to officials, and as something that the empire didn't want to do again. Next slide, please. So consequently, after partition, there was a lot of demand for this library. So there's a lot of press notices there that I've picked out from the newspaper archives. And Rakesh Ankit has an excellent paper detailing the British government's journey to what happened and the toing and froing of the location of these archives. Next slide, please. In controlling the narrative, so Harold Wilson's Labour government appointed Nicholas Mansberg as editor-in-chief to select unpublished documents from the India Office Library. He said, in view of the great interest now being shown in historical circles in the last days of British rule in India, that was the reason why he published this 12-volume called The Transfer of Power 1942 to 47, and the editors will be independent historians who will be given unrestricted access to the records and freedom to select and edit documents for publication. And this series is actually available on the Internet Archive to download, so it's a great series to have a look at just to see what the UK had decided what the transfer of power looked like. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to take a sort of brief interlude into some of the creative inspirations from the archive. So I'm going to talk about Ian Forster and Eliza Fay, the making for Passage to India. Next slide, please. So Eliza Fay was an English letter writer whose engaging letters were one of her few assets when she died in 1815. These were subsequently edited and published into a book in 1908 by Walter Kelly Firminger, who added archival facts in his notes, and that first picture is his book. Ian Forster came across this book during his research for A Passage to India, and he publishes his own edition in 1925, describing the letters as little character sketches, delightfully malicious. And in his introduction, he actually credits Sir William Foster, CIE, who allowed access to India Office Library for him to present additional facts about Mrs. Fay. So he used the archives too. And just as an aside, during his research, he comes across the artist A.W. Devis, who made one of the only pictures of Eliza Fay that we know of, which is on the left there. And Ian Forster tries to work out how Eliza Fay and the artist's paths may have crossed. So in researching this, he finds the artist is mentioned in an account of the Pilo Islands by George Keat in 1788, who was on an East India Company boat, the Antelope, in 1783. So he conjectures that they may have crossed paths in 1784. And this leads to his next creative inspiration, a letter to Madame Blanchard, 1931, and that's on the next slide, please. So this is a little pamphlet that he wrote. This is one of the first pamphlets of Hogarth Letters Press, which was a press made by Leonard and Virginia Woolf. And he sort of imagines the actual Madame Blanchard is not an imaginary person, he's an actual person, but it's an inspiration on a letter that was never delivered from the India Office Marine Records 570A and 570C. So that's quite an interesting interlude that he had from the archives. Next slide, please. So, in the main, his seminal work at least for the British UK public, was The Passage to India. So he published this in 1924, and it's a reflection of his visit to India in 1912 and 13, and his duration as private secretary for the Maharaja of Dewas Senior in 1921 and 22, and he dedicated the book to his friend Ross Masood. And so that's the first edition there. The book was adapted into a stage play by Santha Rama Rao, who in 1957 met Forster for permission to move forward with the production, and he gave his blessings but made several suggestions for changes in the script, and that ran in the West End from 1960 to 62. The script was also used in the BBC's Play for Today, directed by Waris Hussain in 1965. Ian Forster was still alive then, so Waris Hussain was speaking to him about his depiction. Ian Forster was famously quite not a fan of the US, so he wouldn't have wanted Hollywood to take this film, but David Lean asked permission in the 60s but refused. David Lean actually gained the rights to make a feature film in 1984, but he almost entirely rewrote the script. It was in the contract that Santha Rama Rao's script had to be used, but he entirely rewrote it. What's quite interesting is that the producer of A Passage to India, the David Lean film, was John Brabourne, who's also known as the 7th Baron of Brabourne, whose father was Governor of Bombay and then Governor of Bengal, and John Brabourne, had married the daughter of Lord Mountbatten, and he'd been trying to seek these film rights for 20 years. So a quite interesting background there to it. Next slide, please. And so Salman Rushdie, who's wrote a fascinating essay called Outside the Well, which is published in Granta in 1984, actually talks about this period in UK British history where the British Raj was, there were many films about India, and I'll read his quote here. So anyone who has switched on the television set, been to the cinema or entered a bookshop in the last few months will be aware that the British Raj, after 3.5 decades in retirement, has been making a sort of comeback. After the big budget fantasy double bill of Gandhi and Octopussy, we have had the blackface minstrel show of the Far Pavilions in its TV serial incarnation, and immediately afterwards in the grotesquely overpraised Jewel in the Crown and David Lean's film A Passage to India is in the offing. And he also goes on to say, I haven't seen Dickie Attenborough's Gandhi yet, he said, but as far as I'm aware, nobody has yet succeeded in putting India on the screen. And he goes on to say the Indian film industry, from Satyajit Ray to Mr. N.T. Rama Rao, will no doubt feel suitably humbled by the great man's opinion. So next slide, please. So how do you find these archives? So labels, guides, and finding what you're looking for. Next slide, please. So my study was basically on the British Library India Office guides. Unfortunately, at the moment, they are not available because of a cyber attack that happened about 1.5 years ago in the British Library, so it's very hard to get anything out of the British Library at the moment. But this is a map of how to get any information anyway. So you go to the main page, South Asia section, and there's 4 main guides. The only guide there is to the actual numbering and the unique records is at 12, which is further information. And there, the British Library asks you to look at Martin Moore's guide to the Indian Office records. And it's actually a book, which they had as a PDF there. But I find that very inaccessible because you don't have to read a book to actually find out what's in the archives. But also, strangely, 9 miles of these records have been digitised by Adam Matthews, and they are only mentioned on the website at the time at points 16 and 17, and they've got excellent guides where the whole history of the archives is detailed quite well. So it's funny that, you know, behind a paywall you can get a very good guide, and on British Library's website you can't. And I'll just highlight 11 as well, so further readings. Untold Lives blog is quite an interesting blog, and it basically is from the British Library workers, the researchers there, curators. They write stories about the British Library and about British people in India. Next slide, please. Thank you. 2 minutes left. Thank you. So the next slide is on colonial papers at the TNA, and I'll go through these quickly, but they have a better guide. So they've got how to look for colonies and dependencies from 1782, how to look for Foreign Office and Foreign and Commonwealth Office records, and how to look for Empire and Commonwealth records. So next slide, please. I did an online survey of South Asian users of British Raj archives in the UK. So there's some of the points that they made there. I won't go through all of them, but one interesting one is a lot of the users ask for repatriation, even if it disadvantaged the UK user. But there was also a note that in India, at least, the government's restrictions on records are stricter than the UK. Yes, there's a few ideas that people had there. And then, in conclusion, I concluded that the labels, guides and other materials described as contested and complex material is not adequate. Adam Matthews' digitised collections are behind paywalls, they're not described adequately, there's no online context to help global users, and little context for describing the histories of material and how they should be described in a modern multicultural UK context. So I concluded that these archives were built on and are still subject to prevailing attitude of superiority from a Western standpoint. There are clear barriers to access and key improvements that can be made, and hopefully when the British Library comes back online, they'll build back better. My last slide is, thank you.
Thank you very much. A brief shot of probably what you wanted to say. We would have liked to have heard more about the archives that you managed to get or those that you did not manage to get, because quite often that's where the trick lies for the next person to meander through. I open up the floor for any questions. We take 5 minutes or 1 or 2 questions. If people need time to think, we come back at the end and we move on to the next speaker. Do you have a question? Did you have a question? Right, so I think your turn will come again towards the end. We move on to the next speaker, who is...
We didn't get, the people online didn't get a chance.
Can you check?
Go to gallery. Right. You can ask people online.
Yeah. So if there's anybody joining us on the web and you have a question, please raise your hand or say something. Okay, so we'll have a think while we go through the next 2 speakers, and perhaps we'll have a chance to come back at the end. So we now have Thomas Newbold, who is at this university, and we'll talk about what Pakistan remembered of the palace, relics and their care in Rajshahi during the long partition. It's an interesting topic, how the same set of relics or instruments or material found is treated so very differently depending on the perspective of the finders.
Thank you. Okay, to start with the title. On the title slide, I'm not sure if it can be fully seen. There's a little, something I saw on a letterhead. I thought it was fun, so I put it on everyone. It's a part of the correspondence between the museum and the epigraphist D.C. Silchar. and the correspondence was conducted on older letterhead, and so staff at the Virendra Museum repeatedly crossed out India and wrote Pakistan. So that's how the correspondence was conducted. So, next. So what Pakistan remembers of the Palas is a work in progress and is the outcome of 2 very short research trips to the Virendra Research Museum in Rajshahi. And I undertook these trips to think through some of the ways in which a research museum, which had been created primarily to house Sanskrit and Bengali manuscripts, as well as sculptural collections dating to the Pala and Shena dynasty, found a place for itself in Pakistan. Now, as I found no documents relating to what I was mostly interested in, which is the acquisition and perpetuation of the manuscript collections, I ended up actually writing a different kind of paper about what Pakistan remembered of the Palas by way of the objects and relics left behind by the Palas themselves. Because there exists across 3 or 4 bundles in the museum's main filing almirah, a wealth of information relating to the management, care, and extension even of the museum's collections of medieval sculptural objects. So the next slide is a magical almirah, or where the files are, which is not what people usually go to see in the Virendra Research Museum. And the next one are the files, or some of the files. So it's about 21. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. There's about 21 slides, files in bundles like this. So Pakistan, as is well known, and if I'm allowed a measure of emphatic exaggeration, was a land for the future, in the sense that it was saturated with very many anticipations and a lot of expectations of those invested in it. So we've heard from Sayyid Firdous quite a bit about that. Now, given all of this, it's no surprise that there has been tremendous work on the relationship between the making of Pakistan, the quest for the future, and the search in general for a break with the past. Now, in what Pakistan remembered of the Palas, I'm instead going to try to ask the question of how the inhabitants of a significant but provincial city in Pakistan's eastern wing, Rajshahi, came to reckon with objects embodying a past they at first understood to be merely residual. So the relic of a past made twice obsolete, overtaken both, of course, by the demise of the medieval monarchies that had first generated these objects, but also by the collapse and dispersal of the bourgeois class that had first collected them and curated the collections in which they were housed. So I note that despite all of this, Rajshahi's museum leadership ultimately established a culture of caring for said relics, and in so doing engendered the possibility of new effective relations and new genealogical imaginings between the Pala past and Pakistan's eastern wing's present. Now, in other words, what Pakistan remembered of the Palas is a paper about the unanticipated trusteeship that was created by Partition's upheaval, displacement, and removals, and about how the subsequent curatorial relations and the relations of care, in a sense, engender new bonds between the Bengali Muslim present and the Pala past. Now, the necessary starting point for this paper is to reckon with the fact that the hallowed Virendra Research Museum, which is even today Rajshahi's most venerable institution, and its vast collections of Pala and Shena sculpture, were in colonial times an institution with whom Muslims had, by and large, only sporadic and tangential association. Now, I'll not speculate on ranking the social and cultural reasons for the distance, some of them are obvious, but I wish to note the absence of any particular antipathy towards the founders of the institution. In fact, one of the museum's founding fathers, Okukumar Moitro, was widely admired amongst Bengali Muslims, and still is, for his best-selling defense of Siraj-ud-Dawla, and in fact remains after his death a cherished figure. The museum's first acquisition, so item number 1, is in fact a donation by the town's foremost aristocrat, Muslim aristocrat, Lal Muhammad Sahib. And yet, nonetheless, the membership of the Research Society, the management, and the staff of the Research Museum were almost all upper caste Hindus who left, leaving the museum with particular challenges. Now, the challenges of Partition were not at first apparent. For the sole Bengali Muslim formerly trained as an archaeologist at the BRAC, Maulvi Shamsuddin Ahmed, who was a consummate epigraphist and a student of one of the Deccan's foremost archaeologists, Ghulam Yazdani, the work of collecting and acquiring had professional protocols to it, and the Virendra Research Museum would continue to run, so he thought, in collaboration with his office, as it had before. Next slide. So in fact, on the 5th of September of 19, you don't need to read this letter, it's just here as a kind of artifact. In the 5th of September 1947, Shamsuddin, who had just left his job in Calcutta's Eastern Circle to become the superintendent of the new Archaeological Survey of Pakistan, wrote to Niratbandhu Sanyal, the curator of the Research Museum, to announce that the office of the district collector of Dinajpur now had what was going to be Pakistan, or Pakistan's Eastern Wing's first archaeological discovery. A couple of images found in the Nashipur Arakanese camp, a British-built shelter recently vacated by Buddhist Rakhine refugees who were returning to Burma after having taken their refuge during a violent episode in 1942. And we do not know what relationship the Rakhine had with these images. Did they find them? Were the images found afterwards? This is entirely opaque to the correspondence. So the process by which the two images came to the attention of the authorities, I cannot understand. But the two Nashipur images, which are identified in the collector's correspondence to Shamsuddin as a Mahatmya and a Kali, began their journey to what would eventually transform them into Virendra Research Museum accession number 2547 and Virendra Research Museum accession number 2548. Now, on the 19th of September, so it's like barely a month, Shamsuddin Ahmed and Niratbandhu Sanyal dispatched a deputized museum official, Babu Dijendra Kumar Chakraborty, from Rajshahi to Dinajpur with a letter from Superintendent Shamsuddin himself, instructing the Dinajpur district collector to hand over the sculpture if, quote, the sculptures in question are found by my agent deputed to be bearing iconographic or artistic merit, end quote. Babu Dvijendra Kumar was efficient. He left Rajshahi at night on the 26th, traveled on the international border because it's Hili Bazaar, which you know very well. It's exactly where the track is, and made it there the following day, and immediately recognized that the two statues were not Durga Mahatmya and Kali, but the Buddhist goddess Tara and Chamunda, a tantric deity. And so, in his report, wrote back, quote, they seemed worthy of acquisition for our museum, bearing iconographic novelties and artistic merit, end quote. Now, the, quote, treasure trove, as the correspondence calls it, using the legal language current at the time, was hard to pry out of the administrator's hands. The collector was not sure about whether the Archaeological Survey of Pakistan's Eastern Circle had the authority to claim the images or whether the provincial government itself needed to authorize this, but eventually, after further corresponding, complied. Eventually, on the 24th of February 1948, after a second trip, Vijendranath Kumar returned, quote, with the two stone images, one representing a novel type of Chamunda, the other the Buddhist goddess Tara. Now, Sanyal, so let's see them here. We've got the images. Sorry, this is the Kadiravani Tara, so Virendra Research Museum 2547, and the next slide has the Chamunda Rudra Charchika from Nashipur. So these are what Babu Vijendranath Kumar for the Archaeological Survey of Pakistan brought back. Now, Sanyal would describe the statues as valuable, both productions of the Pala School of Art, which flourished in eastern India between the 9th and the 12th centuries AD. Yet even in their new home, however, Virendra Research Museum's accessions 2547 and 2548 were hardly safe. Can we have the next slide? Now in eastern India, the Pala and Shena art had come to be lionized by a nascent archaeology that Tapati Bhuvatarputta described a lot, as and in particular through the work of the famed Ratal Das Bandopadhyay, who's the second of the two volumes, and was one of Paharpur's actually early excavators, as a kind of almost a model for a national art to be. For this kind of art, then, trouble was on the horizon. So can we go to the next slide? By 1949, if we read the first annual report of the Virendra Research Museum, we see the museum secretary, Kitish Chandra Sharkar, detailed that safeguarding against theft and depredation was wholly inadequate. Key documents were being lost. He wrote, "It is shocking to let the learned world know that the copper plate inscriptions bearing on the landmarks of the history of Bengal, especially the Gupta Damodarpur plates, for those who know are incredibly important, the Pala Kalimpur plates and the Anulia plate of the Shenas have been stolen by breaking open the locks of the room. A greater threat, however, loomed still on the horizon for the health and well-being of the museum. It was to be turned into a hospital." He wrote, "I hope there will be no cause for alarm henceforth from the wild gossips of substituting this noble, magnificent edifice of the past for a medical school or college or any other institution in replacement of it. This temple of knowledge has got an abiding interest in the minds of all cultured people, and its utility remains eternal to those who intend to live up to the tradition and cultural heritage of the Bengalis as a glorious race or nation, be a Hindu or a Muslim. Now, this invocation of the principle of utility was really not shared, especially by the builders of hospitals. They found them rather more useful than museums. Nor, in fact, was the traditional cultural heritage of Bengalis interesting to all, especially to District Commissioner Majid Khan, chairman of the Committee of Management of the museum and a United Provinces Civil Service cadre transfer, so not a Bengali, who in fact was the man proposing the establishment of the museum. Majid Khan's machinations were not senseless. Now, Rajshahi district was an impoverished place, afflicted by famine and out-of-control food prices, convulsed by agrarian protests in 1950, and according to police reports, which had traded imperial paranoia for nationalist fear, the specter of communist and Hindu insurgency. It was also a place where the state would hold on to power, as we know from Ahmed Kamal and others, with extreme violence, and in fact more so than any other district in Pakistan's eastern wing. On the 24th of April in 1950, Majid Khan's own corpse executed in Rajshahi Kapra ward 7 leftist political prisoners. Ila Mitra's ordeal is also took place in the same district. In his memoirs of Rajshahi life in the 1950s, Prabhu Chandra Lahiri accused Majid Khan of working, in fact, to erase the town's historical memory. He singled out his decision to rebaptize the British Officers Club to Muslim Club, his closing of the Sanskrit College, his disposal of the portraits of the town's previous Hindu civic leadership in the municipal pond, his rebaptizing of the Raja of Digapatya's hospital from Promenade Davosto Chikataloi to Rajshahi Shadar Hospital, and other such activities. I have unfortunately been unable to hear Majid Khan's own, or find Majid Khan's own take on things, but we'll continue to look for them. What matters, however, to my project is that despite Majid Khan's machinations, the museum did not shut. Cramped in just over half of what the space it first claimed, it survived the aggression of anatomists and wannabe surgeons. I've not yet been able to understand exactly how it was, but its survival revolves another Urdu-speaking honorary curator, Itrat Hussain Zubairi, who was a Meerut-born, Agra and Edinburgh educated professor of English literature at Rajshahi College, who stepped in once the Hindu leadership departed, and would in due time, in fact, be made the first vice-chancellor of Rajshahi University. An expert of metaphysical English poetry, and by all accounts, in fact, a lover of the foremost poet of the break with the past, Iqbal, Zubairi was, just like Majid Khan, an Urdu speaker invested in the future. But quite unlike Majid, he was willing and worked to safeguard the existing collections of the Research Museum and labored to retain and grow the galleries in ways Congress with Pakistan self-understand. Now, the task at hand, he declared to the Department of Archaeology in Karachi, so this is in the next slide, was to make the Verinder Research Museum, recognize that the Verinder Research Museum was, quote, the only museum of any consequence in East Pakistan with a heritage of lively activity and an equally bright future, end quote. And labor not to diminish it, but, quote, to turn it into a first-rate museum of art and archaeology, quote. He wanted Gandharan art, he wanted Mohenjo-Daro art, and ultimately his efforts, and of course, an Islamic gallery. And these efforts were successful and are what guaranteed, in some sense, the museum's survival. On the 30th of January 1951, Prime Minister Nurul Amin visited the newly inaugurated Islamic wing of the museum on its inauguration, and this in many ways consecrated and safeguarded the museum's shaky place. This place would, however, only grow in later years. So in the last 2 minutes, I just want to show you, and perhaps in the Q&A we can talk about more where it went. So, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Slowly, as Buddhism started finding more and more of a place, and the people have talked about this, we can talk more about it, and Amstutz and others. But in particularly, in the next slide, the Rajshahi collections started moving out of Rajshahi itself and representing this Buddhist heritage of Pakistan to the world. In this case, this is an urgent request by the Karachi office for the relics to leave for Japan. If we go to the next slide, a list of 12 relics that were moved out, including, if we go to the next slide, the Bihar el Buddha, possibly the most important sculpture in the Rajshahi collections, which moved to Japan. That's a Japanese catalog from 1961 of Rajshahi sculptures with beautiful photos. So they traveled from Tano-Deo, where they were excavated, to Tokyo. And they continued the Palas continued their world-conquering Vijaya, moving next slide, to Germany, where they were not allowed to return to East Pakistan. They went on to Germany and then ended up in Naples. So you can see the 3 locations in Germany where the exhibition moved. And then, next slide, please. Earning ultimately recognition, in fact, as sculpture that needed to be recognized as the sculpture belonging to, quote, the golden age. And that's not my underlining. I found that that's in the Protnoratikoridaftar library of the archaeology, the archaeology department library. Golden age of Bengal art. And so I've been trying to wrap my head around why this happened, and the last slide help us see some of the departures in the 1960s that happened, some of the people that made this possible. Mukhlisur Rahman, of course, the curator. This is his thesis, which starts with the Bismillah and then deals with, is the first thesis written by a Bengali Muslim on Hindu iconography, and it's an absolute work of mastery. And next to Abdul Momin Chaudhry's PhD thesis, also from '65, which changed and deepened an understanding of the period. And I think there's something to be said, can we have the last slide, about the love between objects that can come with care. And this is something I found that Mukhlisur wrote in 1970, where he speaks about the way in which objects spoke to him, and is where I'm going to leave because my time is definitely up. But perhaps I can speak more to it during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting talk. It raises a number of questions. Most interestingly for me is there an ideological kind of baggage to it, in a way kind of imply it? And also, there have been instances where we have found that certain kind of iconography or images or statues found in tanks, old water areas, and people say, it's a Hindu god, let's give it to India. Rather than it's something found here and we should keep it. And somebody I know made a film on that kind of a topic. So yeah, with that I open up the floor. You can take this question and the other that comes.
Helen had her hand up.
No, that was the cursor.
That was just the cursor.
Both online and from India, please, go on.
Yeah.
I'll take the question.
Thank you. Interesting presentation. I have a question about, I know that you focus specifically on the Pakistan period, but since you visited the present, do you have any observation about how the quote-unquote legacy of care continues or is not continued into the present?
Let's take the other question and then you can ask together.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, hi, Thomas. Thanks for that. I was just wondering if you could give us a sense of where this placing of the objects is happening alongside the separation of the dancing girl and the bearded man from the Indus Valley collections, because that has been written about more, especially, recently. So that question of partitioning museum collections as kind of new patrimonies for India and Pakistan. And I was curious because, I mean, you're of course focusing on the bureaucratic records mostly and kind of like sort of substitution of a new archaeological practice and just department. But I was really struck by the photographs you were showing as well, because they're very modernist photographs. So their emphasis is a two-dimensional frontality, which is very much in conversation with how, British sculptors like Barbara Hepworth are thinking about like not having the dorsal or backward view of sculpture available as well. So these were also, of course, like three-dimensional objects that were not necessarily fixed on architectural sites, but were freestanding objects as well. So I'm just curious about where this kind of emphasis already on their translation into a sort of two-dimensional frontal-facing object for the page of the book, whether that's something that is already ingrained or whether that's something you're seeing happen.
Absolutely, yeah, with pleasure. So the first question about giving to India, is something that none of the, it's something I think that was rendered impossible or difficult by the museum's own constitution when the Berenda Research Museum was created. It was created in direct opposition to the National Museum, Indian Museum in Calcutta, by this local Rajshahi Bodhrog society in the very early 1900s, like 1910, 1911, with the idea that finds in Rajshahi, in Dinajpur, ought to stay in North Bengal and not just go to Calcutta. So there were actually a number of provisions forbidding transfers of their own collections. Nonetheless, people did, I think, try. There was a big question when the endowments were stopped about whether materials would go to India. And I do suspect that Majid Khan would have been very happy if he could have gotten rid of all this stuff and just made his dream hospital come true. But I think there were people, and I think there's something that comes with people like Shamsuddin or with Israt Hussain Zubair, who's not an archaeologist, but is obviously a man with a certain sensitiveness and understanding, that in some ways these things were going to stay here, you know, and of course, you know, and there is some continuity in staff. The secretary of the museum stays until 1965, Kitish Chandra Shorkar. So there is continuity like that, and everybody works with Kitish Chandra. And so in terms of that gift to India, in fact, if anything, they continue to collect. And so we have, in fact, occasional correspondence with the police, in which they get the police to like prize away from local Hindus sculptures, and it's not so nice, that the Hindus are worshipping, but they say, no, this is a Bala sculpture or a Sena sculpture, it's got artistic merit, it's going to come in. And then, and so then the correspondence is like, the villagers will say, okay, well, but if the Raja of Digapatya says, okay, that we can give it, we'll give it. But please give us a new one in replacement or something like that.
This is still happening in Bihar.
So the Pakistanis are actually collecting, in a sense, collecting and museumizing after this initial period of give it up and so on. Care, the practice of care today, that's a great question. I think in some ways the museum is really defined by the extraordinary quality of its initial connections. And I think the question of the continuity of care, I think if somebody's not aware of this, it raises questions about the collection, because most visitors to the museum often ask their Ansar or anybody who's standing why the Islamic gallery is so poor. And of course, that has to do precisely with collecting in some sense. You know, except for this hurried collecting, I think, to save the museum from being a hospital, the tremendous labor that went into was connected with Paharpur, with the various deals around. And so there's a number of sites that were brought in. I'm not sure, I can't really answer technically about I do think that in some ways, they might have lost some of the prominence. I mean, it's difficult for me to, I can't speak of this, and there are people in this room who can speak to it a lot better than me, but to see things like this leave from Rajshahi, you know, packed nicely, insured, and go on a 4-year Digvijaya of the world, you know, I think it speaks to pride the museum had in, and the pride the archaeology department had in these collections. And I don't think, I think there's quite a lot that's good in Rajshahi right now. I don't think, however, there's that capacity to translate whatever practices of care are extant now into something quite like what the museum was in the 60s, especially in this area that led Nazimuddin Ahmed, who's Shamsuddin Ahmed's son, by the way, to say this is the art of a golden age. So, about questions of separation of the patrimony, I think in some sense part of my questions about answer about the constitution of the museum itself answers the difficulty of separating the collection. So that was not possible to divide up the collection. It was technically a sort of private endowment overseen by the Newbold government. So it had a charter, but it was privately administered. And only after 47, the district collector, rather than the Raja of Digapatya, becomes the chairperson of the management committee. What is interesting is that, however, they demand, the first letter from Zubair, in 50, when he takes up, he writes both to Pakistan, and I showed that letter, asking for Mohenjo-daro stuff. He also writes to the Archaeological Survey of India in Calcutta, asking for them to supply things from their new digs, which are happening across. And so I think in that sense, and even today, the museum has a collection of materials that belong to the Archaeological Survey of India, which have not been return. So they are on continuing loan from the Archaeological Survey of India. All materials from the Archaeological Survey of Pakistan instead belong to the Archaeology Department of Bangladesh. So that's different. But there are materials. There's an Indus collection. That's I think he is someone that came from Calcutta, however, on loan, and I think continued and continues today. About photography practice, I'm so glad you said it's not something I'm conversant with and I can't speak to, and so I'm really grateful for your insight. They did not take photographs and described everything by writing, and only on the occasion of the Japanese exhibition do they negotiate with the with the Archaeological Survey for a photographer to be sent and for professional photos to be taken, and I would love to know more about them. And then most of the photos instead that we have to wait till the 1990s catalog. So for example, the Nashipur sculptures are not photographed until Mukhlisur Rahman's own catalog came out towards the end of his life.
Very interesting. With anything on the ideological aspect of it?
Well, the ideological aspect of it. Well, the ideological aspect is sort of Prof's that in that sense I'm trying to say. I wondered about the question. So there is, people have worked on the ideological aspect of concern for Buddhism. And,
I didn't have a question, I had a comment if that's all right.
Okay.
It's actually off what ma'am said regarding whenever you find Hindu idols here, the thought of sending it back to India. I remember I went to the National Museum possibly last year, and we saw a man praying to one of the artifacts, a palace sculpture. Possibly, it was a black stone shape. I think
Yeah, it was a black stone shape sculpture, and the man was literally
like
he was praying to, he was worshiping it in the middle of the museum. So, and the question, there were the questions of.
And there were other also. There was a very visibly Muslim couple being like, "Eta dekhta bana, chalo, eta dekhta bana." You know, but this, and it also reminds me. Doing some RA work for Samia Haq ma'am, we spoke to Hindu respondents, and one of the Akus that I spoke to, she said that, people tell me as a Hindu I should just go back to India, but I have never been from India. My family is ancestrally from this region. It's not that we came after partition or something. So it just, it was just really interesting how even the idea of finding the idols here, they're expected to be sent back to India.
I think we need to see if there's any question
from online, yeah. No questions from online? So I'll just answer very briefly about ideology, which I think gets to the meat of the paper. So I think the question of relationships between art collecting and have often, I think, revolved around the question of the relationship of the collection to the political project. But certainly, that would be, that was a wonderful piece on Ratadas Bandyopadhyay, who was in fact very much part of the organizing of this museum itself. And also Amsutz's work on Buddhist collecting in West Pakistan, the Gandharan art, and their importance there, and the way in which thinking about Buddhism. And Anya Janara Kabir has also said some of these things about how thinking about Buddhism in the two places helped give a longer history and a deeper logic to think about East and West together. But I think there's also another story to be told that comes with care of trusteeship, because to be honest, the museum in 47 was pretty imperiled. And the possibility of elaborating a program that would recognize, I think, Pala art as significant for a deeper logic was really not necessarily available with those who stepped up. It's not something that Ibrat Hussain Zubair knew about. It's not something the next great Amir Jahan, who was a specialist in Napoleon Bonaparte, knew about. It's not even something that Mukhlisur Rahman, who was an Islamic art specialist from Islamia College, knew about. And so I think there's something, all of these people were, however, in some ways professionals. I think and Shamsuddin was an epigraphist, specialist in Arabic epigraphy. I think all of them sort of in some ways stepped up to the challenge, continued collecting, and eventually the next generation, so Nazimuddin or Mukhlisur, when he went out and changed their topics, right? So you have this generation of people in the 60s who start having Bengali Muslims going out and doing PhDs that relate to these collections, that work on the copper plates, that make use of the new finds that the department was growing, right? And you have people in India getting jealous about about this. Because of their practice, so you have D.C. Silchar, the greatest epigraphist, who has to write this book called Epigraphy from East Pakistan, which came out in just after independence, but it's still Bangladesh, and it's got an incredible foreword about independence written from an epigraphical standpoint, trying to wrestle on the fact that all of this material really changed the way you cared for stuff, I think. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I think we have
Could I
to
just make a really
wait for after the other speaker speaks. We need to give them all equal time. So we now have Sukriti, Bhukkal. Right. Oh, it's going to join us online. Right. So she is from Haryana, from Higher Education in Haryana, or Department of Higher Education, and a professor of English. Her interest is in the interdisciplinary aspect of literature and its relationship with politics, community, and identity. Sukriti is going to speak on digital turn in partition studies, a methodological study of 1947 partition archive, using Derrida's discourse on the archive. So that should be very interesting and very different from what I know. So, welcome, Sukriti.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone. I'll just begin. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
All right. Thank you so much. I will be speaking on digital turn and partition studies, methodological study of the website 1947 Partition Archive using Derrida's discourse on the archive. Please, next slide, please. I feel like a plant that grows in a bottle. I have no roots. I can be put anywhere, says 76-year-old Aftab Ansari. He was 9 when his family took a train to Pakistan from Delhi on August 11, 1947, 3 days before the partition of India took effect, leaving behind everything in Allahabad. There were others who made the journey in reverse. Joginder Singh, now in his 70s, fled Lahore with his family in 1947. He made it to India, his sisters didn't. They were abducted on the journey, and Singh, a businessman now, hasn't heard of them since. Praful Kumar was 8 when he saw his father shot dead and his mother killed with a sword as they were fleeing their home in what is now Kashmir. The 1947 partition of British India was one of the most traumatic events of the 20th century, leading to the mass displacement of over 14 million people and widespread communal violence. Over the decades, the study of partition has evolved from a focus on high-level political negotiations to the inclusion of personal narratives and oral histories. These are just a few of over 1,000 stories that stitch together a narrative of pain and loss. Stories that are now part of the 1947 Partition Archive, a crowd-funded oral history project that records history from partition survivors from across South Asia. Stories that recall happy childhoods that changed overnight and speak of families that suddenly found a border drawn between them. Conceived and initiated in 2010 by US-based Gunita Singh Balla, a physicist by training, some of the collections can be viewed on the project's website and their social media pages. The digital age has transformed how partition is remembered, recorded, and analyzed. The 1947 Partition Archive is a significant example of this paradigm shift, collecting and curating over 10,000 oral testimonies alongside digitized photographs, letters, and artifacts, creating what it terms itself as a global digital museum. This paper examines how the digitalization of partition memory impacts the way history is preserved and accessed, using Derrida's archive fever as a critical framework. Derrida's analysis of the archive, the original concept of the archive, suggests that archives are not neutral repositories but are shaped by technological, political, and institutional forces. The digital archive differs fundamentally from traditional archives, altering the authority, accessibility, and interpretation of historical narratives. By situating the 1947 Partition Archive within Derrida's discourse on the archive, this paper explores the implications of digital memory of partition studies. It argues that while digital archives democratize historical knowledge, they also introduce new challenges. Next slide, please. The digital turn in partition studies. Partition studies has traditionally relied on colonial records, government documents, and official historiographies. However, since the 1980s, scholars such as Urvashi Kotaria, Gyanendra Pandey, and Ravinder Kaur have emphasized the importance of oral history in understanding partition as a lived experience. The shift from state-centered narratives to personal testimonies has allowed for a more nuanced and diverse understanding of partition, highlighting gender experience, caste-based violence, and localized community histories. As Bhukkal asserts, the testimonies on our websites are not historical or judgmental. The rise of digital technology has further transformed this historiographical approach. The 1947 Partition Archive is an example of how digital tools are reshaping the way partition memory is preserved and accessed. Unlike traditional archives, which are housed in physical locations and governed by institutional regulations, digital archives operate in decentralized, often crowdsourced ways. The Partition Archive and it terms itself as being dedicated to institutionalizing and decentralizing the people's history of partition through oral testimonies as primary resources. The archive prioritizes first-hand accounts from survivors and their families. Next slide, please. Creating a repository of lived experiences rather than official records. For instance, Bhukal's grandfather, as is mentioned on the website, refused to believe that partition was going to be a reality. He stayed put in Lahore up until he was caught in the communal frenzy that left him no option but to leave. His car was fired at as he drove down roads strewn with the bodies of riot victims. Bhukal's grandmother had earlier escaped the carnage as she took a train to India with her children. Crowdsourced contributions. Volunteers, researchers, and everyday citizens contribute narratives allowing for a more democratic approach to historical documentation. For instance, it's quoted on the website, "We are you." There is an open Google form that allows anyone from around the world to share their personal stories as well as nominate themselves as the individual who could arrange for a conversation with a partition witness. Third is multimedia preservation. The archive includes digitized copies of personal photographs, letters, and belongings, and enhancing the visual and emotional impact of memory. Next slide, please. An interesting aspect on the website is the partition map, which shows the city the person migrated to and their life story attached to it. For example, if I search for a city in my state, Haryana, Sonipat, it shows a number of names of people who migrated to India or from India. And if I click on a particular person's name, their life story will show up on the screen. Fourth is global accessibility. Unlike traditional archives, which require physical access, the digital platform allows users worldwide to engage with partition narratives. This digital turn represents a radical shift in how partition is archived and remembered. However, as Derrida's archive fever suggests, that archives are not passive storage spaces. They are shaped by the very technologies that create them. Next slide, please. Derrida's archive fever, a Freudian impression, was originally a lecture delivered in Derrida in 1994 under the title The Concept of the Archive, a Freudian Impression. It is significant because it calls for a rethinking of the archive in the light of changes brought about by digital communications and storage media. It provides a critical lens to analyze how digital archives function in relation to historical memory. In this work, Derrida explores the concept of the archive in relation to authority, power, and technological mediation. His ideas are particularly relevant to digital archives such as the website we're discussing, which challenge traditional archival structures while simultaneously introducing new forms of archival control. Derrida traces this concept of the archive to the Greek word arche, next slide please, which he explains means both commencement and commandment. He sees this etymology as important as it binds the archive historically to government, power, and law. This reading is at surface level close to that forwarded famously by Foucault in his Archaeology of Knowledge, and I quote, "The archive is first the law of what can be said, the system which governs the appearance of statements as unique events." But in practice, Derrida's and Foucault's analysis follow quite different paths. Derrida returns to Greek antiquity to study The Archeon, the home of the archive, that was initially a house, a domicile and address, the superior magistrates, the archons of those who commanded. His interest in the Archeon lies in the close connection it held forged between the archive and the political power of those who governed it. And I quote, "The citizens who held and signified political power were considered to possess the right to make or represent the law. On account of their publicly recognized authority, it is at their home, in that place which is their house, the official documents are filed. It is thus in this domiciliation, in this house arrest, that archives take place." The key point of interest in this description is that archive was originally situated in a privileged space which the archons or magistrates traditionally governed. For Derrida, the consequence of this is that the archive became both a place of commencement and commandment. It was both sequential and just, or in other words, an archive took place as an event because it could be kept in place both physically and politically. In contrast, the website, the 1947 Partition Archive, presents itself as a radically democratic space where anyone can contribute and access historical memory. However, despite its openness, it still operates within digital constraints that shape how history is recorded and interpreted. For example, digital platforms require standardization in data entry, which can limit the complexity of oral testimonies. The authority of the archive has shifted from state institutions to digital algorithms and curatorial decisions, but it has not disappeared entirely. Derrida argues that archives are not simple places where memories are stored. They also shape how memory itself functions. He links the archive to Freud's theory of the unconscious, suggesting that the process of archiving alters what is remembered and what is forgotten. Derrida suggests that the structure of an archive determines what is preserved and what fades away. In the case of the 1947 Partition Archive, this raises critical questions. How do digital algorithms affect what stories become more visible? Does the act of digitizing a memory alter its emotional and historical meaning? What is lost when oral testimony is transformed into a searchable digital file? While digital archives provide unprecedented access to historical narratives, they also mediate memory in ways that are not always apparent. The use of search engines, metadata tagging, and keyword indexing means that certain testimonies may be prioritized over others, shaping the way partition is collectively remembered. Next slide, please. Decontextualization and the risk of depoliticization. One of Derrida's most significant concerns is that archives, by their very nature, involve acts of selection and omission. Digital archives, in particular, run the risk of decontextualizing historical events by presenting testimonies in isolation from their political and social frameworks. The 1947 Partition Archives aim to document everyone's history, but in doing so, it sometimes removes narratives from their historical specificity. For example, a testimony about communal violence may be presented as an individual tragedy, rather than as a part of a larger political process involving colonial policies, nationalist movements, state-sponsored violence. This depoliticization can lead to a weakening of history, where the structural causes of partition become less visible. Next slide, please. The shift from physical to digital archives has significant implications for historiography, particularly in the field of oral history. Digital archives make history accessible to a global audience, allowing survivors and their descendants to share their experience without institutional barriers. Many partitions are now in their 80s or 90s or above, and digital recording makes it crucial for capturing their memories before they are lost. Digital platforms allow users to engage with historical materials in new ways, including multimedia storytelling, virtual exhibitions, and interactive maps. Next slide, please. And in conclusion, I would say that the 1947 Partition Archive represents a significant movement in the historiography of partition, marking the shift from straight control records to participatory digital memory. While it democratizes historical access, Derrida's archive fever reminds us that archives are never neutral. The digitalization of memory alters how history is constructed, remembered, and interpreted. While digital archives offer invaluable resources, they also introduce new epistemological and ethical challenges. Future research must continue to critically examine the impact of digital technologies on memory, ensuring that digital archives do not merely collect testimonies but also provide a more nuanced, contextualized understanding of the history of partition. The digital turn in partition studies, while revolutionary, requires ongoing critical engagement to navigate the balance between accessibility, authenticity, and historical rigor. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an apt warning to all of us not to take everything we read for granted. Also to So I'm saying that that's an apt reminder to all of us not to take everything we read and see for granted, but to cross-check and also perhaps learn to read between the lines before we come to any conclusions, even if it is archived or digitized material. As you say, there may be many angles which are left out, and so much depends, of course, on the reader and our ability to read through them. Right? I open the floor up to questions. Comments?
So my question was about this 1947.
Without it, speak.
So my question is, like,
Can she
from
hear you?
Maybe you can
Do you want to come to the
Closer to the computer,
So my question was, can you hear me? The microphone. So my question is, like, about this archive. Who are the people who actually created it, and how did you come across it? So what were your like influences to start this research?
I have mentioned in my presentation, it is by a physicist based in the US. Her name is Gunita Bhalla, and her grandparents also moved from Pakistan, Lahore in Pakistan, to India. And her grandparents' stories inspire her to create this website. And as far as I'm concerned, I came across their Facebook page, and there was a video that intrigued me about a story from one of a village that is very close to the place I come from. And because it is interesting, even though there were many families, I belong to a very small place called Kethal in Haryana. It is not popular, it is probably not known to Indians also. But a lot of families, Muslim families, migrated from Kethal to Pakistan, and but there are no official records. There is very little that is written about them. But this website had covered one of the families who are based in Lahore, or a village near Lahore, and that really intrigued me. I was very interested in the way they actually made the effort of contacting these families, recording oral testimonies, recording their personal stories. Because usually whatever we feel that is worthy of archiving or worthy of storing is data, statistics, records that are officially relevant, but personal stories I feel get lost because partition is not just a political event, it is a personal event for many. So I feel this website definitely captures it beautifully if you go through it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other comments, observations? I think it's a great challenge for anybody to pick up. I often wonder about doing a family archive, and I wonder how I would do it and who would be interested in reading it apart from myself. So there are great challenges about reaching out as well, right? Are you yourself involved in any process of making archives, or you just read and access them their own learning?
So after I came across this website, I have done a workshop with them which kind of trains you to interview people or contact them. And I got married recently, and I got to know that my mother-in-law's family comes from Lahore, and they have not been My mother-in-law's father's sibling is actually from Lahore. One of the siblings came here and the other sibling was left there. And they have never met them, they could not contact them, they don't even know where they are. So as of today, my mission is to, if I can, use the resources that the website and the team behind it provides me. If we can find a way to locate them, that would be, I mean, it's in the process and we're hoping for the best. So that is the project I'm currently working on with it. Yeah.
If there aren't any other comments coming right now, I'd like to give Alia Carter another opportunity to perhaps say something, and if anybody has thought further on her topic, which was, let me see, this was about colonial archives, South Asian colonial records in UK institutions. I give them to some of you have tried to use them. I have tried to use them, and it's a nightmare, particularly because you have to find them in different parts of the city. And I think that some of them have been relocated, some of the libraries have closed, and then they've been relocated as well. So you have to look through various indexes to move from one to the other. And eventually, maybe you found it, and then you go to the librarian. Yeah, so you might tell us about your experience.
Yeah, so the reason I was interested in doing this was because I worked in the British Library, and I worked on a project with rare books that the British Library hold because of the Press and Publications Act during the British rule of India. So one copy of each book would be sent over there. But in my time when I was doing skills exchanges, I heard anecdotal. People were very concerned about the India Office Library, so that was the paperwork that was in the UK. And what I was interested is in who selected this paperwork. So it was a small select British civil service trained in the UK with no Indian, there was nobody there from India until very late on. And then the separation at partition of the paperwork into India, Pakistan and then Bangladesh, and how that happened and who got the lion's share, and then this kind of debate on the India Office Library, which is still in the UK, and then this kind of controlling of the narrative with the Labour government publishing this transfer of power. So instead of people asking for the library back in India, they selected paperwork. So this kind of selection throughout its history, trying to guide people to a certain way. And also, but what was interesting was when I did my user survey, one of the people that I spoke to was saying, well, in present day India, the controls over archives are quite harsh as well. So do we need to send all the archives back? And I had that in my own experience. I went to India for a skills exchange, and we were looking for a map of India just to use on our website. And we were told, we went to the National Library of India and we weren't allowed to see one. And we had to ask the Indian government for permission, and we were told that we wouldn't get it because it's the partition. The space is so contested in India, especially with Kashmir and the borders, that there is no map. So that was quite a surprise to me. So yeah, I think this is, the archives are quite political in my mind. And I just want to say a quick word about the 1980s in the UK. So that was a time when there was a lot of memorialising of India, partition, the Raj, and all the films that I mentioned were between 1981 and 1984, as well as documentaries. There were a lot. So in the British consciousness, I feel that these films and these books and what was taken out of the archives is had a huge impact on the British consciousness of partition and that time and period.
Hi Alia, I had a question for you because I'm interested in A Passage to India by Forster. I was curious if you could tell us a bit more about the kind of research Forster undertook for writing A Passage to India.
Yeah, well, I think so it's early research at the moment for me, but I think these letters, the original letters, I've got a copy of the book here actually. It's the original letters from India by Eliza Fay, and he was so interested in this that he did his own copy of them. And then also I think he worked there between 1912 and 13, and he also had a very close friend, quite a very close relationship with a Muslim man who was studying with him in Cambridge, and he went out there as well. So I think he had personal and an intimate relationship with this person as well. So here, I think that was his research, working, studying, and also being there was what brought Passage to India into fruition, I think, for him.
Thank you.
I think what I would like to do is to open the floor up to all the speakers. If you have questions which you haven't had time to put forward, if we have about 5 minutes or so, we can take 1 or 2 questions.
Oh, yeah, I was just, I think, trying to continue that conversation with, I guess I'm just, as somebody who, I know you're also an 18th and 19th century, so as somebody who doesn't work on the 20th century, I'm often really frustrated by historians of the 20th century wanting all categories to be new in the 20th century. So I was just really struck by how you were working through the kind of, the sort of, the surprise of these Pakistani bureaucrats and Indian aristocrats about the collections. But of course, like, these Pala objects have been in the region, people have lived alongside them, and if you go to even early modern sources, you will find passing references to them, right? And of course, that's so much of the work being done right now. And so I'm just curious where, as you're doing this work, not repeating the conceit of your sources, that, like, Pala is not maybe disciplinarily a category being invented in the 40s, but as a cultural practice, as a civilization, as a history, is not. And so those are questions that we as art historians have to deal with constantly. And I'm curious what that lens of it is, so that you're not just, again, reproducing this history of the invention of Pala in the 20th century, which results in, this really important question of there were no Hindus here, or there were no Buddhists here, or they were only there way in the past, right? And of course, all of these work on, Rapadas and ASI debates are so important that they were very much also about how to establish archaeology as an objective science, which the discipline has rebelled against itself.
No, absolutely. Can I take that? I think it's really helpful, and it's helpful for me to think with you on this. Now, I think what's really significant for me is, in a sense, the main thrust is that I have to reckon or wrestle with a group of people that develop an interest, or develop an eye, and ultimately cultivate a certain series of practices of recognition vis-a-vis the object. So in the case of Mukhtasar, they were trained in order to be able to describe it, and for this they'll go back iconologically. And so in that sense, I guess in many ways, what the novelty that I'm interested in, and I think this helps me, clarify that, is precisely the emergence of a disciplined art historical eye amongst the Bengali Muslim vis-a-vis the Pala sculpture, in the sense, and I think I found it incredible that Mukhtasar had his 65 PhD thesis, and he inscribed the Bismillah by hand on it after completing it, and I think that's not a mode of relationship that existed prior to this assumption of a certain kind of curatorial trusteeship in a modern disciplinary museum.
If we presume modern is British.
If we presume modern, but even just in the spatial organization, it allowed, in a certain sense, a relationship, I think, that, broadly speaking, could bypass other questions of relationship to object, which would have been more fraught, perhaps, and in that sense, there is, I think, something that I want to recover about really, about sort of the archaeological imagination, if I want to run with Michael Shanks in that sense, or that there's a certain way in which objects can be perceived and can be a part of how you relate to them, they relate to you, they relate to you. That's what I want to recover. I want to recover how a certain archaeological imagination came to be for Benoist, and I do see a certain discipline practice, and I think I need to reflect more about how divergent it's from ways of relating to the object that pre-exist, which I can faintly trace in the archive at the very beginning, maybe it's in the 20s or 10s when people bring objects, for example, and think of some stuff.
Thank you for a very interesting session and a good conversation. We have to come to a close. So the panel Partition and the Making and Unmaking of Archives, I think a very apt title for what we have been discussing. I suppose we have to move on to the next, which is the closing keynote. Let's go with you somewhere else.
You can say goodbye to someone. Sumaya, goodbye to them.
Hello, so this session is over. Thank you, both of these were so great. I learned so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye. Thank you.
It's going to just commemorate again, mark the end of what I hope has been a great days for people who have been here, have been exciting, and etc. So I would like to begin by giving the floor to Asifa, because she is really the person who brought this conference to us and will tell you more about it.
Yeah, so thank you. I was just thinking, this morning I was just thinking what to say about this conference, because we have been working on this conference for so long, just thinking that this has been, particularly the gestation period has been so long. We were thinking about it since, I think it came in 2023, towards the end, and then for some time we thought that it was going to be in February 24, and then we realized that it is going to be the following year. So we started working on this, I think the call for proposal went sometime around April and May, and then we were really working hard, trying to invite people, and then around July and August we had a break, and then a lot of things changed, so we were a bit unsure about whether we'll be able to have this conference or what the modalities could be. So around October, November, I think we decided that we'll go ahead with it, and then we started working on this, whether we are going to have a hybrid one or in-person one, or if some people could travel. So eventually we decided on this note that we just sort of it. So I'm just, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating in this work actively on this conference, and there's been so many people came from some of our guide students, some of our alumni, from other departments and other universities. So it's just, I think, for me it has been a very, very meaningful conference and experience in general. And I was also just thinking about the scale of this conference. We probably didn't see many people in this conference, but I still think that it's a very close-knit group who have common interest in partition studies. And so I personally like the interaction a lot. So I really hope that you also gather a lot from this conference. So,
I'm Mowtushi. I'm the person who's been pestering everybody with emails and bearing with me, sending them Zoom links and conference programs and abstracts of presenters and the papers. For me, this has been a learning experience. I came on board after I heard about this project, and I'm very happy to be here, very honored to be here. I also would like to bring your attention to our amazing team, the ANH team, to run the Humanities. We have Alia, we have Shakita, we have Shahad, and Zaki is in here, and Sumaya is here, and our lovely student volunteers have been working really hard. Not just these past 2 days, but the past 3 months. This has been, I think, personally a learning experience. I'm not a partition scholar or historian, but for me, coming from the literature background, this opens up wonderful avenues for us to take this conversation further. And I hope we keep doing conferences like this, maybe symposiums or seminars. I hope we keep in touch. The third part or leg of the Memoryscapes conference is happening in Lahore. This was the second part in Dhaka, and we would have, I think, access to that part of the conference. And so when I do get the Zoom link for that, I'll share it with all of you again, which I've become quite expert at, sharing Zoom links and so on and so forth. And it's good, it's an ongoing conversation between Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And together, those 3 conferences, we're envisioning it as a workshop of sorts, so that we keep talking about this, we keep coming to this topic, and we produce more works on it, and that this becomes a vibrant area of study and intellectual, critical, and personal reflection and recollection. Thank you so much from my end.
And Mowtushi talked about the 3 conferences. I just want to give you an idea of who the people involved in this were. I think the first we came to Asifa from Lake Janishin, who's in college at the University of Delhi, and she wondered whether we would be interested in such a conference. They are part, and now thanks to her, we have become a part of a project called SPARK, which is actually being led by an IIT in Silchar. And when we got Silchar, we were very excited. We thought this was somewhere we'd really like to go to, just across the border and all that. But of course, July came and prevented any such travel. But anyway, Silchar and the University of British Columbia in Canada had a memorandum with each other by which partition studies, new methodologies, and historiographies would be studied and explored, and they would have a workshop with their students, resulting in a conference, which was scheduled in December. And Silchar then sought funding, and they got money to hold it in other countries, Bangladesh and Pakistan, because as our keynote speaker was saying, the Indo-centric nature of partition studies have been disturbing Indian scholars as well. So they reached out to us in Bangladesh and to LUMS in Lahore, Pakistan. And unfortunately for us, we haven't had all these exciting people traveling to us, because we had to make a decision. We couldn't have some people traveling, some people not, and all of that stuff. So nobody was going to travel here. We would have it in a hybrid mode. And I must say that Mowtushi has done a wonderful job of locating people in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, who would be interested in the topic, who would have interesting things to say about the topic, and also that I'm surprised that even within our department, we've had at least 4 people that do partition studies. And though Mowtushi says she doesn't know anything about partition studies, her radioscape, her soundscape, came into that very well. Sabiha was another presenter, and we've heard Thomas, and we had Nizar, who does migration to Malaysia and Singapore, but he connected that with the partition to show how diasporic lives also got separated with the partition. So it was also good to discover people in our department who were interested in this. We hope to take the work that we've got forward in the sense that we would like to have some publications out of it. I think the Spark team is going to have a special issue somewhere. But we at BRAC University very excitedly are going to revive the BRAC Journal, which has become monument and dead, by having a special issue based on papers done in this conference, of which Sabiha is going to be the main editor. So in a way, we will hope that this conference will have generated a journal. We also hope that we have laid the foundations of what could be a history program, a discrete major in history. So that goes beyond this conference and involves many other things, many other hoops to go over. But yeah, we can show this. Look, we can do this, and this is historical, and this is even looking at new methodologies so that the literature department can host it, can become the humanities, can become history as well. Yeah. So, and it was wonderful having everybody with us. And now we can all put our hands and say, "Woo, it's over." I hope you feel along with us, the organizers, that it was good. I hope everybody else agrees who have been around, because we've had such engaged conversations throughout the days.
And the interaction from this room to the other side of the computer, I think that also has gone fairly well.
Yeah.
Except
one session, yeah.
There were some audio issues.
There's some audio issues.
If you'd like to know more about this conference, you can Google Spark Canonizing 1947. So under the conference section on the top right, you can read about the conference that took place in Silchar in December. And we're going to put up this one very soon.
We have to
today.
send
We have to send them with the materials tomorrow, hopefully, and then the LUMS one, which is happening later this month, will also be put up, so you can keep the entire report next week, 24, 25 February, right? So it's all online, and it's really wonderful, the website, and the way they've canonized, thinking about canonizing partition.
This is the canonical picture. Something else.
For the last conference, when you send us the link,
I'm waiting for the link. They'll send us the link, and I'll share it with everyone.
I'm sure you'll need a registration.
Which they will hopefully share with us too. I'm just waiting for that as well. Yeah, online registration.
But everything is last minute.
Yeah.
Plus also our website wasn't up till the weekend.
Our website was up for
just
some
with
time,
quality
but
papers.
it crashed the day we started, and the morning of the conference, the website crashed.
Yesterday.
They sent the links and everything, send it to everybody. It's turned out
Okay, so
thank you so much.
it's over and
Lovely
now.
to see you. Congratulations.